Hello, AP Euro. Welcome to the asynchronous day here at Governor Mifflin. So today's lecture is going to be kind of short. Normally, I know they tend to last like about 45 minutes to an hour, but that's because I like to pause, ask questions and discussions, things like that. But today, it's going to be just you listening to me, and I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. I don't expect that to go for too long. So hopefully you can pay attention, take some notes. I will post this slideshow on the Google Classroom with this link to this YouTube video for the presentation. And without further ado, let's get going. So, European culture. We talked a lot last time about the politics of the early Cold War from the late 40s until the very early 60s, 61. So now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be focusing on the cultural and economic aspects of what happens in Western Europe mostly, but we'll mention Eastern Europe a little bit as well during the Cold War. So let's get going. So first things first, we can call. Oh, also really quick, as an aside, if my camera here at the bottom, I think it's this side, I'm not sure. If my camera at the bottom of the screen is blocking a picture or anything like that, again, the slideshow will be up so you can see. I apologize in advance. I just thought this would be better than just listening to me talk. You could actually see me too. Anyway, so the expanded welfare state is what we could call Europe in the second half of the 20th century, right? From about 1945 to 1975, that 30-year period, Europe's going to enter what's called like this Gilded Age or this Golden Age. And expanded welfare state is part of that. Now, why that came about and what it is are important. So with the Marshall Plan, right, giving tons of money to the countries of Western Europe, France, Norway, Denmark, Western Germany, Italy, all these countries gaining economic aid from America, well, they get hundreds of millions of dollars. So then they rebuild their bridges and their roads and their towns, and then what do they do with all their leftover money? Well, they have this idea that democracy is by and for the people. So if the people aren't doing well, then thus democracy is not doing well. So they decide to invest that money in their people in things like free healthcare, free education, or at the very least heavily discounted in some countries. And they supplement that with the extra money they get from the Marshall Plan, creating all of these social programs that exist across Europe. One of the reasons why these programs exist in Europe and not America is because throughout all of AP year that you've learned so far, Europe has had a constant history of putting the group above the individual, like willing to sacrifice a few individual freedoms for the benefit of the entire group, whereas that does not exist in America. So that's the reason why this is able to exist and continued to exist in Europe even until today. But one of the things that came out of the expanded welfare state to make sure that all these countries could take care of not only themselves but also each other is the common market. Now, the common market is going to be the precursor to the European Union. So here you can see in this map, we've got a couple of countries that joined initially in 52 when it was set up. And what was the goal of the common market? Well, it was to make sure that these countries didn't compete with each other. It sounds, the way that it's described almost sounds like communism, but it's definitely not. It's pure socialism. It's not communism. So the difference would be that in communism, let's say they're talking about the coal trade, right? The coal trade in Europe. In communism, a communist organization would take all the coal and then evenly split it up among everyone. Whereas in a capitalist system like in America, it would go to the highest bidder. Well, the common market kind of sets up an in-between, right? It's going to go to the highest bidder so long as it's someone within this group, right? We want to make sure we're helping each other. If I'm going to buy coal from someone, I'm going to try to buy it from someone within the common market instead of going out to the Soviet Union or something or America, paying a little bit less, but then screwing over all the other allies that I have here in the common market. So we're going to make sure that we work together and we're going to set up these capitalist systems but with strict rules on how to cooperate with each other. So that way, not only do we help each other grow, we don't screw each other over, but then also we can prevent each other from preparing for war because war is really expensive. And if you have a bunch of countries keeping track of each other's economies, well, it's going to be a lot harder for one side to prepare for war without everyone else going, hey, what are you doing? So it's a way to kind of keep these countries from going to war with each other as well, and it is very effective. They don't really want Britain to join at first. Britain is a little too capitalistic, too much like America, and they're not really cooperative with the rest of Europe. And this is evident throughout all of the European Union's history, right? Even when the European Union is set up, and Mr. Kurtz will talk about that later, Britain keeps their own money. Just recently, they left the European Union, so Britain does not have a good track. Britain does not have a good track record of cooperating with other unions. Sorry about that. Sometimes my microphone turns itself off when it's not playing music. Um, but when it can record, but then it turns itself off. So every once in a while, I might have to turn my headphones back on. Sorry about that. Continuing on, let's see. One of the things that's brought about because of the common market is the European coal and steel community. Now, this was set up by a guy named Schumann, who's pictured right here. And what this community that they set up is a way to trade coal and steel with each other and no one else. And in addition, they all agree that they're going to invest heavily in the coal and steel markets. Poland, even though they're not part of the union, Poland and Spain are two great examples of this, where they take most of their aid and they build up so many factories. Now, Poland's on the eastern side and Spain is on the western side, but both sides do the same thing, showing that regardless of capitalist versus communist, they have similar ideas. They build up their coal and their steel industries to great effect, and in those two countries in particular, their coal and steel productions were up 400% of what it was pre-war. So not only did they recover from the war quickly in Spain, France, Italy, and a little bit in Poland as well, they were able to multiply their pre-war outputs by 4, showing just how much success these countries are having. Now, Poland is an outlier in Eastern Europe that they're able to do that. The rest of the countries are Western Europe, right? And they are able to do that so much so that it's going to give rise to a whole new type of ism, and that's consumerism. So here's a quote by Andy Warhol that I really like. It's what's great about this country is America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same things as the poorest. You can be watching TV and see Coca-Cola, and you can know that the president drinks Coke, Liz Taylor drinks Coke, and just think, you can drink Coke too. A Coke is a Coke, and no amount of money can get you a better Coke than the one the bum on the corner is drinking. All the Cokes are the same, and all the Cokes are good. So this idea that the poor and the wealthy can be equal through consumerism is something that permeates American and Western European culture. By buying things, by you have this extended income, get something, buy something. It exists because, well, now you're getting cool things, right? So capitalism win for you. The economy is doing better. And at this time, especially in Europe, with those rules, those socialist rules they set up in place, when the economy does well, the people also do well. So they're highly encouraged to participate in consumerism, as that not only rebuilds the infrastructure of their country more, but it helps to just simply build up their economy to be stronger. Here are 3 examples of goods that were super popular in Europe during the 50s and the 60s. Coca-Cola, refrigerators, and motorcycles became 3 hot ticket items that everybody wanted. Refrigerators are a really interesting one. I like talking about them, especially in Austria. In 1940 or 50, I can't remember the decade, they had about 30,000 refrigerators in the country of Austria, but by 1960 that number jumped up to 589,000, almost 20 times as many refrigerators in less than 20 years, which is crazy. How fast popular items like this were able to multiply and be reproduced in these Western consumerist countries, whereas that did not happen in the East. Just not to the same scale, I should say. So the next topic we're going to talk about is feminism, the second wave of feminism. The first wave of feminism, as you guys learned about, the whole goal of that was women's suffrage, and that was the successful movement. And then in the 1970s, a new feminist movement starts that goes from the 70s to the 90s. And what was the goal of the second wave of feminism? And that is the rights to define your own family, basically. The lives of women were defined by family and work responsibilities, economic changes, and feminism. Well, many women wanted the ability to define what family meant to them. So this is going to present itself in 3 ways, and I have slides for 2 of them, but first one I'm just going to talk about. And the first of that is divorce. Sorry, I had to make sure that it wasn't something else. The first thing is the right to divorce. In most countries, divorce was legal, but it needed the consent of both husband and wife. However, with the second wave of feminism, they're pushing for just single-party consent. And while it's not Europe, this does happen in America in the 70s. Ronald Reagan passes in California the right for single-party divorce, which was seen as a really huge step forward for the feminist movement, because then it allowed women in abusive relationships to escape their partners and their husbands. Because before, if you were in an abusive relationship and your husband didn't want to divorce you, tough, you're stuck there. And a lot of people thought that is incredibly unfair. So the right to divorce a partner for any reason did not need to be cooperative anymore. One person could do it, and That was one of the things they were fighting for. The second thing is the right to have birth control, not abortion, birth control. So when it comes to, well, they do fight for abortion as well, but I'm talking about birth control specifically. So first of all, on the side of the screen over here, I show you guys how abortion pills work, because a lot of people don't understand the science behind what abortion pills do. Those are the different pills do different things, but those are generally the three things that all pills do, either by themselves or in combination of. And hopefully you know enough about the human reproductive system that I don't need to give you a biology lesson and you understand what all those words mean. But we're going to talk about Envoid and how birth control pills were not legal in many countries, as people saw that as the same thing as abortion from many people at many times, until eventually, by the 1990s, most countries realized birth control and abortion are not the same thing. One is contraceptive, the other is post-conception. Which is where a lot of people end up drawing the line later on. There are a lot of countries that end up banning and approving birth control on a whim. For example, Ireland bans birth control for many years up until the 90s. They're not going to allow birth control until the 90s. France and Italy are also going to impose some restrictions on birth control, but not as many. Whereas then you have people like Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, West Germany. They're just going to allow birth control pretty early on in this movement. Um, what do you think the reason for that is? Why Ireland, France, and Italy, why are they hesitant to allow birth control? Because they are Catholic countries. Good job. They're very heavily Catholic countries. Now, Ireland is actually, it's a surprisingly progressive country, but there are some weird like lines that they draw in the sand, and birth control was one of them for a long time. The second thing that women want is the right to define families for themselves, right? So that's going to be IVF, or in vitro fertilization, or artificial insemination, are going to be uh, something that they fight for the right to have. These test tube babies, right? Which, really quick, while they use the term test tube babies because it was catchy, babies were not grown in test tubes. For those of you who are unaware of how IVF, or in vitro fertilization, works, you take a couple of egg cells from a woman, you take some sperm from a man, you take the strongest cells, and you intentionally implant the sperm into the eggs, and then you put that fertilized egg back inside the womb and allow it to latch on. So basically that's how it works, right? So it's not that crazy of a thing. But there are some countries again that don't like this. France and Italy again don't allow um, single mothers or people in homosexual relationships to use IVF because again, very Catholic countries. But ironically, there are other countries again. Like this is something that Ireland does allow. It's weird. There's lines, and Ireland's a weird country when it comes to what it does and doesn't allow. Um, but long story short, this ability to have people, they don't need to go through the traditional route of having a kid, right? If they're infertile or unable to have kids the traditional way, they can use this method and actually maybe start a family. So this is going to give women the right to start a family even if they weren't capable of having it before. Additionally, single mothers or people who are in homosexual relationships could use this. A lot of countries ban that still. For example, in the 50s, in England, being homosexual is a crime. Like, you could go to jail for it. So that's not going to change quite just yet. But eventually, by the 90s, this does come around to being an option for everyone, which is why the movement lasted 20 years. It was because they were asking for a lot of people. And while they were getting minor concessions along the way, they kept fighting until they got all of it by the 90s. And that's the feminist movement. So the new modes of marriage, partnership, motherhood, divorce, and reproduction gave women more options in their personal lives. And that's what the second wave of feminism was about. It was options for your personal life, whether it meant divorce, controlling your ability to have kids, things like that. Eventually, abortion as well. In fact, during this second wave of feminism is when we see Roe v. Wade passed in America. So abortion is part of this as well, although that's not as widely accepted still to this day as birth control or IVF. Um, so yeah, it was all about personal options. There's one particular feminist who is really important. So if you need a name, one feminist you could talk about is Simone de Beauvoir. Now, she was a French philosopher who believed in existentialism. So for those of you guys who don't remember what existentialism is, you can look at Nietzsche, who was the German philosopher that you guys learned about earlier. He was also an existentialist. And existentialism is the idea that there are no preconceived like goals, or you're not born with a purpose. You make your purpose through your actions. The things you do in life are going to determine what you're supposed to do in life. It's not like you're born with some grand plan. You're not born with any innate You're not born with a goal in life, you have to make it yourself. So she considered herself to be a feminist existentialist. So this kind of elaborated itself in a way that allowed women to kind of break gender norms, because she argued that, well, with existentialism, no one is born with like a given goal. So gender roles don't really exist, right? Like a woman's job is not to be in the kitchen, cooking, raising a family. It's to be what she makes of herself. If she chooses that that's what she wants to do with her life, spending her life raising a family, cooking, cleaning, being at home, a homemaker, well, that's fine. That's what she chooses. Her actions have dictated that's her goals. But society has put these pressures on us, not any kind of natural or innate thing. So if a woman wanted to break away from that and go do her own thing, perfectly valid is what she argued, which today doesn't sound like that crazy of a concept, but keep in mind in the 50s when she was making these arguments, in the 50s and early 60s, that was a novel concept. Breaking those gender roles and allowing women to do what they felt they wanted through their own goals and ambitions as opposed to what was socially expected of them was a novel concept, especially in many European countries like Western Germany and France. So in Western Europe, through the efforts of feminists, and in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union through government policy, women finally gained the vote, greater educational opportunities, and access to professional careers, even while continuing to face social inequalities. So the social inequalities are going to rear up in the third and fourth feminist movements that are going to happen in the early 2000s and the 2010s, which is still technically going on today when we talk about social inequalities, like the pay gap, and like the disproportionate sexual harassment with like the Me Too movement, things like that are going to be continued in the newer waves of feminism. But this wave was also widely considered a success because through the efforts of these feminists, you have more options for women and more rights allowed to them. The Soviet Union did the similar thing, but they did it through government policy. They brought equality to the workforce, not because of social change, but because the government said, we don't care what your gender is, you're working. And sure, maybe everything's terrible, but it's equally terrible depending on your gender. They don't just, so that's the difference. Is Western Europe went through a cultural change based on a movement. Eastern Europe went through an economic change based on government policy that both heavily affected equality of women. So there's your differences between the two. So let's talk about three particular feminists that were, well, three women who gained power during these movements. We'll start on the far side over here with Margaret Thatcher. So Margaret Thatcher was the first female prime minister of Great Britain. She has a nickname. She was often called the Iron Lady. She was a staunch conservative, and Mr. Kurtz is going to talk a lot more about her when he talks about modern European history, like the 90s to today. But she was a hardline conservative and a very controversial figure in British history because she was a woman who was gained power through these feminist movements, right? Allowed to become prime minister, first woman in, I shouldn't say allowed, was elected prime minister. The first female prime minister in British history. It's an awesome thing, but she's controversial because she was also very, very conservative, and while she through her policies about inflation reduction, she ended up keeping Britain out of a mini recession. She was also a super hard line with a lot of other things when it comes to like prison reform, and like the Falklands, which was a thing that happened in South America. This war that basically happened when she like crushed it with very harshly. So again, a very interesting figure to talk about and very opposite compared to the other one. The next one we're going to talk about, which is Mary Robinson here in the middle. Now, Mary Robinson was the first female president of Ireland in the 1990s. I think she got elected in 97. She was incredibly liberal, and thanks to her, she allowed a lot of rights to women and homosexuals in Ireland. She fought for equal rights for homosexuality, for women. She allowed birth control to be legal in Ireland. Ireland was the first country to legalize same-sex marriage. So Ireland was strangely progressive, most of that under Mary Robinson. And usually when you have someone who's that extreme, whether it's left or right, they're usually very polarizing or confrontational figure in the country's history, right? Like if you think of in American history, all the figures, sure, they may have done some good or bad, that were very, very polarizing, extremes on either end. There are definitely people who dislike them. But with Mary Robinson, she actually remains to this day the president in Ireland with the highest approval rating of all time, with a constant 93% approval rating. Everybody loved her. Which is not something you can say for most presidents in most countries. Finally, we'll talk about Edith Cresson, which based on her name, I bet you can guess she is from France. She becomes the first female premier of France. Sorry about the words in the background, I forgot to delete those. She becomes the first female premier of France, which is like the prime minister, but the title is I was saying it's like the Prime Minister, but the title is Premier. Now, Edith here was kind of a centrist and not too much of a controversial figure until her scandal, where she ended up embezzling some money and had to resign. So not a great look for her, but first female premier of France. So we start seeing women gain positions of power all throughout Europe in the Margaret Thatcher gained power in 79. These other two women gained power in the 90s. But thanks to that, we're starting to see female world leaders start to emerge, and there are many more today. It's nowhere near equal to that of male world leaders, but it's closer than it was back in the 90s, you could say. So, women attained political office and increased their representation in legislative bodies in many nations. Now, there's one more topic that we have to talk about today before we're all done. Oh no, I'm so sorry. Before I get to that, I wanted to talk about pop art. So, pop art was a style of art that existed. Came about in America, and it was supposed to represent popular culture in art, hence pop art. And it was meant to challenge or complement a lot of the growing social movements that we saw in the 60s and 70s. Things like consumerism and feminism. You can see in some of these artworks, some famous pop artists include Americans like Andy Warhol and Keith Haring, our local Berks County boy. Let's go. Um, and they definitely had different opinions. For example, Warhol said that quote earlier about consumerism, right? He was very pro-consumerism. He even painted Campbell's soup cans because he thought everyone could relate to that. That's something that, wealthy or poor, everyone has had Campbell's soup. Everyone knows what it's like. Everyone can relate to it, which is why he chose to paint things like that. You also get people painting like Benjamin Harrison Day Jr., who painted this painting and this painting up here, using the style of Ben Day dots. By the way, it's the two that look like comic strips. That's Benjamin Harrison Day. Ben Day Dots was a style where it would kind of look like a comic book, which again, comics are in the newspaper. Everyone can relate to that. They also, a lot of them took jabs at feminism. And by jabs, I mean supporting jabs, not anti-feminism. They supported the feminist movements through their art. If women were trying to gain bodily autonomy, well, then they might paint pictures of women either like naked or doing things that they believed feminists would be wanting to do. Now, again, they take a lot of their inspiration from the feminist movements themselves. Haring did this a lot. Haring was also anti-consumerism really quick. So where you have Warhol was pro-consumerism, Haring was anti-consumerism in their art. They both just had different styles. But one thing about Haring is in 86, Keith Haring was actually commissioned to paint part of the Berlin Wall. And that section, you can see him painting it right there. And that section of the wall is actually still up today. You can still see it today. Fun fact. So now let's talk about the final topic of the day, and that is decolonization. So decolonization is all of the countries in Africa, Asia, all these British colonies splitting away from Europe. And there's a bunch of different ways they went about doing this. Some did it peacefully, some did it violently, some in between. So I want to talk about some key examples of specifics that you can point to for peaceful, violent, or in between separations. So the first one we're going to talk about is India. We'll pause here if you want to read it. Is India. So India had the National Indian Congress, which was a body in India to try to decide how they can best gain their independence from Britain. India had tried to gain independence before, about 100 years earlier in the 1850s, and it failed horribly. Britain violently suppressed India, which led to 100 years of British rule on the subcontinent. But then you have this guy here, Mahatma Gandhi, who ended up maybe he wasn't the first to do it, but he was the first to popularize it on an international level of nonviolent and peaceful protest. These actions of marches and hunger strikes and simply just being places, and just not being violent, Britain got kind of tired of it. And eventually, after many, many years of back and forth, Britain just said, you know what, fine, it's not worth it. We'll give you your independence. But Britain did something cheeky during that 100-year rule. They ended up pitting the Hindus and the Muslims against each other in India. And that kind of division still exists to today, as what was going to be one country ended up being split in 1947 when they gained their independence into India and Pakistan. India being predominantly Hindu and Pakistan being predominantly Muslim. And these two countries still dislike each other based because of the infighting the British kind of sowed the seeds of through their time. But these countries are going to gain their independence peacefully through nonviolent peacefully. There's some violence, as there always is, but on the whole, it was a peaceful revolution. They gained their independence. India becomes independent. Pakistan becomes independent and is split into two parts. You have Pakistan and West Pakistan. West Pakistan will eventually, East Pakistan, not West Pakistan. Pakistan and East Pakistan. East Pakistan will eventually be renamed Bangladesh in 1971, splitting off from Pakistan into so you have those three countries now. But it all starts with this non-violent protests in India. So there's a non-violent example of countries gaining Nonviolent example of countries gaining independence. Now, the next one is the Algerian National Liberation Front, or the FLN. So Algeria is in northern Africa, and it's a French colony, and they, for a very long time, have wanted to be independent. They actually fought with the French in World War II to help free France, and then immediately France turned around and started being harsh to Algeria again and stripping away some of their rights. The Algerians, not a fan of this, took the weapons that they had used during World War II, and they fought for independence. Now, the problem here is that the Algerians were using weapons from World War II that they were given, and Algeria was not given the good stuff in World War II. And then after the war, France used a lot of their Marshall Plan money to invest in their military technology, and they got even better weapons. So the Algerians don't stand a snowball's chance of beating the French, and they lose a lot. And many Algerians are taken prisoner, and while they are being tortured, while they're in prison, they are being tortured. And I don't have any videos or photos of that because some of it is absolutely horrific. We're talking electrocution, burning, genital mutilation. It's waterboarding. The things the French did to the Algerians was absolutely horrific. But fortunately for the Algerians, whether it was the Algerians or the French that did it, there were photographs and videos taken of this torture, which then the Algerians sent to the people of France, basically, and popularized it throughout the French people. Well, now that the French people are seeing what their military is doing, they're suddenly not on the military side anymore. How dare, and they would do this to women, and sometimes like young adults too. It wasn't just the men. They would torture everyone. So the French people are like, how dare you do this to women and children and just people? They don't deserve to be tortured like this. And thanks to pressure from the French citizens, the French government eventually gave Algeria their independence. So the Algerians had to suffer a lot, but they used the new media, video, pictures that are existing in the 50s and the 60s to kind of push for their own independence from France. So that's another way that they gained independence. The next one is another country gaining their independence from France, and that is Vietnam. So Ho Chi Minh created the Viet Minh, which is the People's Army of Vietnam. Basically what ended up happening is, we talked about this briefly, but I'll go through the history real quick. World War II breaks out. Ho Chi Minh is a communist living in China who's like, the Japanese have taken over my country. This is a great opportunity. China's gonna give me a bunch of weapons. I'm gonna give my friends a bunch of weapons, and us communists, we're gonna rise up and we're gonna fight against the Japanese. And a bunch of people who are not communists are gonna join us because they also want to fight against the Japanese. And we're gonna create the People's Army, and we'll rise up, and we end up fighting the Japanese until 1945 consistently. And eventually Japan's gonna surrender. The war is gonna be over, and Vietnam is going to be have no one there. Now, the French are like, hey, we're going to come take back over, but Ho Chi Minh is like, hey, no, we're going to go ahead and declare independence. And in 1946, Ho Chi Minh declares independence for Vietnam. France, not okay with this. Why? Vietnam and Indochina in general have a ton of palm oil, which is a super lucrative business for the French. They really want to get that money. So, they go to war. Ho Chi Minh's army, the Viet Minh, and the French army go to war for 8 years. It's a bloody conflict that goes all over French Indochina, which is present-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And this war lasts for 8 years until a climactic battle at a place called Dien Bien Phu in 1954. In this battle, the French have 16,000 soldiers in a fort that are surrounded by 50,000 Viet Minh, and eventually the Viet Minh do win. The French surrender, and they give up. They give up their possessions in French Indochina, and they leave, giving independence to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. At the Geneva Convention, the Geneva Conference, not Convention, Conference in 1954, France and Vietnam officially agree to a peace where Vietnam is going to be split into North and South. Eventually, there's going to be a vote to rejoin, but America intervenes and makes sure that vote doesn't happen, so that the two stay separate, and then South Vietnam is going to rise up because they want to join North Vietnam, starting the Vietnam War, blah, blah, blah. That's all later. What we do need to know, though, is that this is a perfect example of a violent overthrow of a European rule from a colonial nation. There were many. This one was an easy example of a successful violent revolution. Ho Chi Minh actually idolized America a lot at the start. He saw himself kind of as a Washington figure. You have this colonial nation that's being oppressed by a European country, just sucking them dry for money, and Viet Minh sees himself as a George Washington, freeing Vietnam from the European oppressors, and he actually idolizes America a lot and looks towards America for help. He even asks America for help overthrowing the French. But America doesn't do it for two reasons. One, the French are our buddies. And two, Ho Chi Minh is communist. And even though we are America's been traditionally pro-independence, anti-colonialism, but But even more than that, they're anti-communist. I'm going to plug in my headset really quick while I finish, so that way maybe it won't die as often. Give me 1 sec. There we go. Hopefully that'll fix that. So, one more example, and then we're going to stop with these examples. The last one is Sukarno and the Indonesian nationalism. Now, Indonesia had been a colony of the Dutch, or the Netherlands, for a very long time. The Netherlands were very, they liked taking islands. Um, it's a thing they did, and they would exploit them for spices and other resources, and they made a ton of money off of them. So the Dutch had Indonesia, and this guy here, Sukarno, before World War II, started what was called the Indonesian Nationalism Party. It was a political party with over 100,000 members that called for getting the Dutch out of Indonesia. Indonesian independence, getting the Dutch out, whether it was violent or not, he didn't care, just get the Dutch out. Well, the Dutch are going to be wary of him, and they're going to arrest him. So he's going to go to jail. World War II breaks out. Japan invades Indonesia. Japan kicks out the Dutch. And Japan sees that this guy's in jail. And it's like, hey, what are you in jail for? And he's like, I wanted to kick out the Dutch. And he goes, hey, Japan, how about me and my 100,000 buddies? What if we support you in the war if you let me out of jail? And Japan's like, that sounds like a pretty good deal. So Japan lets him out of jail, and he helps the Japanese during World War II for a little bit. But then when World War II ends, he and his Indonesian buddies are chilling in Indonesia. And they say, you know what, we're just going to stay independent. Netherlands can't do anything about it. Why? Well, because the Netherlands had been devastated from World War II thanks to Germany invading them and then the Allies invading. The Netherlands were a huge battleground during World War II, so they were devastated. They couldn't send soldiers to Indonesia to retake it. And also, Indonesia is the country with the fourth highest population in the world. I think they have over 250 million people. And it's the fourth highest population of any country in the world. The only countries with more people in Indonesia are China, India, and America. Indonesia is number 4, and it's the largest Muslim country in the world as well. But with that many people wanting independence, the Netherlands aren't going to be able to do anything about it. So they kind of just get their independence due to the fact that the Netherlands wasn't able to respond to Sukarno. Sukarno's going to rule with a democracy for a couple of years until that's going to really just going to be a weak government and it's not going to work. So he's kind of going to make himself a pseudo dictator, and that's going to work a little bit better. He's very, very much not liked, and eventually he's kicked out and thrown under house arrest, and his like vice leader takes over, his assistant takes over. But that's not important because that's not how he gains independence. So, despite indigenous nationalist movements, independence of many African and Asian territories was delayed until the mid and even late 20th century by the imperial power's reluctance to relinquish control, threats of interference from other nations, unstable economic and political systems, and Cold War strategic alignments. Yeah, so the Cold War strategic alignments I want to find interesting. I want to talk about that real quick because in the late 40s, Britain and France tried to take the Suez Canal from Egypt. Egypt gained their independence from Britain, and then immediately Britain and France tried to like attack Egypt to get the Suez Canal. And while they were doing that, America basically was like, "Hey, cut it out, stop it, let Egypt be Egypt," which is not something we normally say. Normally, we would support Britain and France, but we told them not to because Britain and France were being bullies in that region. And America wanted to make sure that the other countries didn't look at Britain and France and go, oh, wow, those are bullies. We need protection. Hey, Soviet Union, can you protect us? And America wanted to prevent that from happening. So they're like, Britain, France, get out. Let Egypt have the Suez Canal. Because we don't want any of these other countries in the Middle East turning to the Soviets. So that's what it means by Cold War strategic alignments. So the next thing is the decline of immigration. Now that all these countries are free, people in England and Europe, people in Europe want to go back to their home countries, or they simply just don't want to leave them anymore, right? They want to give their own country a try. So we can see this rapid decline in immigration from the 60s all the way up to the 90s. As people stay in their countries, or in many cases they leave the European Union to go back, they leave Europe to go back to their original countries. This is going to create a lot of problems and also some kind of interesting side effects in some countries. I will point out that the decline of immigration is definitely a thing until 1991. You see in Eastern Europe it shoots back up. Well, that's because a lot of people had left Eastern Europe to escape the Soviet Union, but when the Soviet Union falls in 91, people want to go back to their home countries. So they immigrate back to Eastern Europe, and that's what that's all about. Anyway, so let me talk about those interesting things, right? We talked about the decline in immigration and how people are leaving countries to go back to their original countries. This is going to end up creating an economic crisis in the 70s as the European countries lost their colonies, so they lost that income, and they're losing the immigrant labor force, right? So that's a huge blow to their economies, and by the 80s, a lot of the countries are feeling that pinch, which is why Margaret Thatcher needed to apply those changes in order to effectively change It didn't help, which is why Margaret Thatcher needed to effectively change the inflation policies to combat this economic crisis that they were suddenly facing. But another side effect of this, since people were leaving, well, that means people needed to take their place. And in one instance, there was a music producer who lost two of their acts to people leaving to go back to another country. So they had to find someone else. And they ended up finding this duo. And they hired this duo on, and this duo is going to eventually become there's going to be four of them. And that is the Beatles. The Beatles actually only exist because of that decline in immigration, because people leaving England to go back to their countries. The Beatles were given a shot. Kind of funny how you can see that without all these other changes, major cult like the Beatles are arguably the biggest band of all time. They are. Everyone knows the Beatles, and here's two links to two different songs. The bottom one was their most popular song of all time, and the top one was a song by John Lennon, which I like to I only put on here because I feel like it's if you can find a deeper meaning to it. In fact, that's actually going to be your challenge. What I have is a blank document attached with this. You just need to answer that one question based on this song, and the question is going to say, based on the lyrics of that first song, that first link up there, what potential Cold War policy could John Lennon be singing about? That's the question. So, you'll be answering that question as your little proof that you'll listen to this video. Anyway, so with that said, the Beatles were also majorly important. They ended up creating a lot of music that was culturally significant to the people of Europe and America. And just no one can deny just how important the Beatles were. So finally, here's the last slide. Because of the economic growth, by the way, this will be posted so you can click the link on the slideshow itself. So because of the economic growth of the 1950s and 60s, migrant workers from Southern Europe, Asia, and Africa immigrated to Western and Central Europe. However, after the economic downturn of the 1970s, these workers and their families often became targets for anti-immigrant agitation and extreme nationalist political parties, which is unfortunate, but we do start to see the rise of extreme nationalist political parties again. Right-wing is making a comeback in the 70s and the 80s. And that's just the result. So with that said, that is the culture of the Cold War. When we come back next time, in person, hopefully, on Thursday, we'll be talking about the second half of the Cold War, the politics of it, right? How the Cold War is going to go from this 1962 to 1991, what's going to happen politically during that time period that we have a whole class to talk about, and what's going to lead to the fall of the Soviet Union. So that's what we're going to talk about next time. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave them as a comment to this assignment or in the YouTube, or just send me an email, whatever. I don't care. I'll find it. But without further ado, I think that'll be it for the day, guys. Enjoy your asynchronous day and have a fun one.